In the 4th century, there was a bishop of the city today in France of Lyon, and his name was Irenaeus. And Irenaeus was a strong voice for I'll put it this way, for the correct teaching about Jesus. He fought against those who would pervert who Jesus was. And anyway, one of the things that he supposedly said was this: the glory of God is the human person fully alive. Now, maybe you've heard that phrase before, but as I think about it, that the idea of being fully alive seems to be critical to the way that we are to follow Jesus. And I say that because it's one thing to think about the person as a physical and intellectual person, but we also need to consider that the human person is a spiritual person. In the class that I'm teaching for nurses, we talk about this in the very first week, that spirituality is intrinsic to every human person. Every person has spirituality. So it's not about religion, but it's rather about the way in which we as human beings find purpose and meaning in the world and in our lives. So to be fully alive means not only to be physically alive, but also to be intellectually at the fullness of our humanity, with all of the ability to think critically, to reflect upon our world and our reality. But it also means to have this intrinsic spiritual character to our lives, where we are seeking purpose and meaning outside of ourselves. Not inside, but rather outside, meaning how we come to know who we are as human beings has a lot to do with how we see ourselves in the world and how we understand the world. It might involve some kind of connection to a divine being, the ultimate reality. It doesn't have to be, but in any event, to be fully alive means to have all of those facets, the intellectual, the physical, and the spiritual, at the fullness of what they are about. So when we consider then how we are to live our lives in response to the world, it's clear that this struggle of being in relationship with each other in community is always going to be that, a struggle. Why? Well, as my nursing class knows, that, well, look how many people are in the world, right? Well, there isn't one way of understanding how these three things relate to each other. Each person has this. So you can see that to be a community or to be in relationship in community means to, one, have a way of navigating all that diversity of beliefs and understandings, or as we say in my class, worldviews. Everybody has their worldview about them. So that makes it difficult to live in the world. And so what we find is, right, you know this to be true, that if we're going to be fully alive in our humanity, we know what happens when we come in contact with people or situations or places that tend to diminish who we are, that sap the strength, that suck the air right out of us. We know that there are times and places that are not healthy to be in and will not contribute to our health or our well-being. But sometimes we get drawn in and get snookered into being in relationship with that power that sucks out the energy from us because we buy into the promises that it offers us. If you walk down this path, our promise sounds like what Genesis does, right? Where the serpent comes, the tempter comes to the first man and the woman and says, did God really say you couldn't eat that fruit? No, God knows perfectly well that if you eat the fruit, you're going to become like God. Well, boy, isn't that a great promise? Wouldn't everybody like a little more power, a little more ability to obtain wealth like buying, continuing to buy lotto tickets, even though the odds of winning the lottery are like 300 million to 1. You might just get it lucky. So there's lots of struggles that we have in trying to be in relationship with each other. Now let me come to the text today, especially the first reading, because this text does not get read very often in our public worship, and it kind of, well, here's the point, that over the centuries of interpretation for the Bible, that the interpretation has focused primarily on the main characters in the Bible. Well, who are the main characters in the Bible? Mostly men. Well, that just makes sense, right? Because who's doing the writing? Men. And so men tend to emphasize the stories of men. And so we tend to overlook stories such as this today of these Hebrew midwives. And in fact, it's interesting that if you were actually to go through the Hebrew scripture, that there are only a handful of women that we actually know their names. And today, we know 2 of the names, Shifra and Pua. And there's just a few, compared to the number of men, right? Almost every man that ever enters into a biblical story gets named. Any woman, well, they just kind of get tossed into a group, the women, or those people, or the other group. So what happens in the story, as you get, that you see the ancestors of the Israelites under Joseph and Jacob all decided at a certain point that living in the only place in the Middle East where there is no water is not advantageous to your future prosperity and growth. And so Egypt has it. So besides the fact that we're in the midst of a famine and there's not been any rain and it's hotter than hell here in the Middle East, and so let's go to a place where there is at least something that will give us relief. And they all pack up their bags and they all go down to Egypt. Now, I'm of course making this a very contemporary story, but in any event, you get the idea. They end up in Egypt and have a great time. In fact, it's so beneficial to them that they, as the text says, they grow in number and increase and now pose a threat to Pharaoh. It's very interesting, isn't it, how sometimes stories just kind of come back around again? Should sound familiar a little bit, right? Those people aren't a part of us, and they're growing in number, and we just have to make sure that they don't outnumber us, because if they outnumber us, they'll force us to speak their language and follow their culture, and we won't be who we are anymore. Not that I'm making this a contemporary application, but you can see the point how sometimes it works. And so Pharaoh imposes, and you have to read this literally. In spite of the fact that some people think that slaves got a benefit from being slaves, it's very clear that the Israelite slaves have no benefit from being slaves. In fact, they are increasingly oppressed with harsher and harsher and harsher tasks. And you can imagine just watching the people around us and over the last couple of months trying to do their work out in the desert, right? Imagine what that would be like in Egypt. In any event, the policies of Pharaoh, and you see this is what happens, that sometimes the policies of Pharaohs sound like advantageous and good policies, but it's like if you just give away some of your freedom, some of your dignity, we'll be the custodians of that freedom and that dignity. And at some point in the future, you will have more dignity and more freedom. And what the Israelites discover is that they have less and less dignity, less and less freedom, and become so enslaved and oppressed by Pharaoh and his empire that they probably begin to lose hope and despair a lot. And you'll hear that in another text in the next couple of chapters in Exodus. So Pharaoh says, and look at the benefit of the policies. The more he oppresses, the more they grow in numbers. And it just scares the living daylights out of him that these people are growing more and more in numbers. And so he enacts a policy, as many times empires, authoritarian states and authoritarian government don't like minorities outnumbering them, and so empires and authoritarian governments impose policies such as a genocidal policy. Let's just make sure that we take care of this, because the greater threat to the empire are the boy babies, because the boy babies can grow up and be the army that will overthrow us. So let's kill off the boy babies. But, you know, one of the scholars that I read on this, you know, what's interesting is if you know anyone who happens to be a midwife, or know what the role of a midwife is, that the scholar says that the midwives, in many ways, were very powerful religious figures in the community. They were often the healers, not just the ones who helped birth to happen, but they were the keepers of the wisdom, if you will. You can imagine being in the place that they are, of being at the birth stool as the baby comes into the world, that the wisdom that they have is first very practical wisdom about how to make sure that this birth happens. And if you know, in the ancient world, right, although it's not surprisingly today in minority communities, that infant mortality and even the mortality of the mothers is increasing in more deaths are happening to mothers and babies in minority communities in the current time. But this was even more true in the ancient time. So what happens is, notice inserted into the text, and this is how I know that these midwives are very powerful religious figures in the community. It says they feared God. Now, be careful, right? Because we have to understand that this means, this is how I see it, and of course this is from a man's perspective, so what do I know, right? I think I told you that one time. I'm up teaching this text like I know everything that there is to know about birth and experiencing birth to a whole class of women, and I stood there and I went, what do I know about this? And they all looked shocked at me because the teacher admitting something that no teacher should admit, that they really don't know what they're talking about. But in any event, that the midwife, now look at the contrast, that Pharaoh and the empire is concerned about the possibility that the boy babies could eventually become so powerful that the Pharaoh and empire might come crumbling down. The midwives are at the place where they are in awe of God. Why? Well, because in awe of that child, that baby coming out of the womb of the mother, and you're there at that first gasp of breath, you have to look at the contrast between the two worldviews here. That Pharaoh's worldview is fearful, dreading the power of a baby, and the midwives being in awe and wonderment at this life coming into the world. So that the focus of the midwives is on life. Maybe that's the focus of God, on life, not Pharaoh. And so, but what happens is that Pharaoh says, you were supposed to enact policy. And here's a catch to the story. The author of the article that I used said, you know, in the translation where it says the Hebrew women are vigorous and healthy and they birth their babies sooner than we could get here. But the commentator says it really is this way. See if I can pull this off. That the word in Hebrew is that those Hebrew women are like animals. They birth their babies in animalistic ways. Now, who are they saying this to? Pharaoh. And you see, the catch is that they're pulling Pharaoh in, hook, line, and sinker, into their way of thinking. Because he he thinks that the midwives hate the Hebrew women as much as he does. And so he just goes, oh, I guess there's nothing we can do. And the midwives are standing there smiling. We've won. We've succeeded. We've defeated Pharaoh. The resistance of the midwives to the death-dealing genocidal policies of Pharaoh. The resistance of these women. And you know what happens? Think of the last line. And God dealt well with them and gave them families. Midwives didn't have families because their whole work was to be available to birth babies. You see what happens is that the civil disobedience, if we can use that word in light of just the anniversary of the March on Washington, the civil disobedience of the midwives comes because they know that the power of God in birthing life is stronger and will always be stronger than the oppressive genocidal power of Pharaoh. That authoritarian governments that impose such oppressive, harsh labor and tasks, thinking that's how they're going to keep people down, will always be defeated when there is resistance to that evil policy of death by those who believe even more powerfully in life. I tell you all that because you see these two women, Shifra and Pua, begin the process of liberation from slavery for the Israelite people. This is the beginning of their freedom. Because do you think that when that story circulates amongst the Israelite people, that these two women not only disobeyed Pharaoh, but did so in such a way that they pulled Pharaoh into that bias against the Hebrews, defeating him in that very process? Do you think that when that story circulates among the campfires of the Israelites, that tomorrow there'll be the same number of Israelites going to work? I doubt it. Why? Because they know that it's possible to disobey and resist the forces that are so evil in their way of thinking and acting that they think that by killing people they will succeed. When the Israelites now know, because of Shifra and Pua, that when you are there to take in life, you will never be defeated. You will never lose. You will always succeed and win. Now, what does that have to do with the story of the gospel? I always say that if we take out that last part, because it's growing up in the Roman Catholic tradition, that last part was the evidence for the authority of the Pope. Peter is given authority to loose and to bind, and so therefore anyway, you know how that story, that's Matthew's edition. That's not in Mark. So the suggestion is that Matthew believes that by letting his community know that there is a direct line connection of authority from Jesus to the leaders of the community, that everything will be okay. Well, that's not the question that gets asked. Say I am. I want you to see that the response is very important to note. Well, people are saying, you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. That you're Elijah, come back from the dead. That you're Jeremiah, that you're one of the prophets. Now, think about what's being said there. Because what they're reflecting is everything that has happened in Jesus' life and ministry up to that point. So what evidence do they have as to who Jesus is, except to see that Jesus is doing what the ancient prophets did? That Jesus is so much like Elijah, so much like Jeremiah, that each of those prophets voiced opposition to the royal authority in Jerusalem. I'm not making this up. This is exactly what, if you go and look at the prophets, that their condemnations of the kings in Jerusalem was universal across all the prophets, because it was clear that the policies of the kings in Jerusalem were counter to the vision and the policies that were intended to be the way the community was shaped and formed by God. So that if the community is shaped and formed by God, then you don't enact policies oppressing anybody in your community. You don't continue to build huge, magnificent buildings on the backs of the poorest people. That you don't misuse and abuse the most vulnerable in your community. The prophets consistently said those points. Isaiah will even say, you want to fast? You want to put more incense on the burners, and you want to sing your chants and shout your alleluias, while you at the same time have no awareness of what you're doing to the poorest of the poor, then this is what I expect. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Have that sound familiar? That's in Isaiah. Oh, it happens to show up in the proclamation in the synagogue in Nazareth, where Jesus proclaims it. Oh, here's the connection. That with the vision of Jesus in terms of the reign of God is intending to do is to say that if you want to participate in the reign of God, then you have to share the vision of the prophets. Shifra and Pua could be prophets. That if you're going to side, remember where we are, Caesarea Philippi, right in the heart and the seat of imperial authority. If you want to give your allegiance to that authority, then know it will always deal in death for you. Maybe not physical death, but it will mean emotional death. And in that instance, it's ignorance or spiritual death, which is numbness. And that's what the prophets are trying to do, is to break the numbness that people have gotten themselves in. Numbness sounds like this. Well, there's just nothing we can do about the problems of the world, so just let it be. That's numbness, where you realize that there's nothing you can do, or you think there's nothing that you can do. The prophets shake that, and shake it up, and shake it to the point where you kind of are just, oh, wait a minute. Oh, this is what being awakened is about. Where you see the vision of God touching lepers, see the vision of God reaching out to those at the edges and the margins. That God is concerned about compassion. Remember how I say it? Slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. That's the vision of God. You ever hear that from the emperor in Rome? Oh, he'll say it, but you can tell he doesn't mean it. Who do people say I am? Peter, in a way, does say the right answer. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Here, Messiah is the word translated for Christos, that's Christ. Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, is anointed one. It's interesting. Do you know that Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, that when he conquers the Babylonian Empire, that the biblical text calls Cyrus the Great, thinking who Cyrus the Great is, a Mashiach, an anointed one. What does Cyrus the Great do? he liberates the Israelites from their captivity and says, go home and be who you are. Mashiachs are ones who are anointed, meaning they have a special task and purpose to be about the work of liberating and setting free. Mashiachs are anointed ones who have the task of recognizing the dignity of everyone they encounter, not just who's powerful and who looks like them or who dresses like them or thinks like them. Mashiachs are ones who are, as anointed ones, who see the dignity in everyone and respect that dignity and welcome the diversity of dignity, if you will, the diversity of peoples that surround them, and embrace the diversity that is within that shaping of community. Mashiachs are ones who will not tolerate anyone demeaning or degrading or diminishing the humanity of another. Mashiachs are one who give ample room to people like Shifra and Pua and all the other great biblical women, who give room to them and say, you have the wisdom. Imagine what it takes. Imagine what it takes for a man in power to say to a woman, you have the wisdom. You have. Imagine what it takes to do that. Mashiachs have what it takes to do that. By the way, you all have been anointed in baptism. You all are Mashiachs. And by virtue of baptism, I hope you now see that when you say, who is Jesus? That we better be willing to put ourselves in the company of Jesus in such a way that from this point on, we share his work of liberating, setting free, lifting up, making whole. That we as Mashiachs, as the anointed ones of the reign of God, we have to act in civil disobedience with resistance to any pharaoh, pope, potentate, president, or authoritarian leader, that we have to stand in resistance to their voices of hate and their policies of death dealing, because we stand birthing life on the side of life. That's where we stand as Mashiachs of the reign of God.